There is a kind of silence you only notice when something that should be there suddenly isn't. In the Carolina backcountry, in the autumn of 1837, mornings usually began the same way. Roosters in the yard, smoke rising from the kitchen house, the creak of wagon wheels somewhere in the distance. Life on a plantation followed a rhythm so predictable that neighbors could almost tell the hour of the day just by the sounds drifting across the fields. But on the morning of October 15th, something was wrong at Harrow Hall. A farmer named Hiram Cook was the first to notice it. He was driving his wagon up the dirt lane just after sunrise, delivering a load of fence posts he'd promised the owner, Elias Tanner. It was a routine visit. He'd been there dozens of times before. But as his wagon rolled closer to the house, Cook felt something he would later struggle to explain. The place was too quiet. No voices, no movement, no sound from the cabins behind the house. At first he thought the workers had simply started the day early and gone out to the fields. But the fields were empty. When Cook stepped down from his wagon and walked toward the cabins, the strange feeling in his chest grew heavier with every step. Doors stood open. Beds were empty. Cooking pots hung where they'd always been. Nothing was broken, nothing was disturbed. And yet, everyone was gone. All 43 people who lived and worked at Harrow Hall had vanished during the night. No wagons, no tracks, no witnesses. Just a plantation that had gone completely silent before dawn. And what investigators discovered next would raise a question no one in South Carolina could fully answer. How do 43 people disappear from a plantation in a single night without anyone seeing them leave? Subscribe to This Stories channel so you don't miss the next story waiting to be uncovered. There is a kind of silence that does not belong to ordinary life. Most silences are harmless. They arrive naturally, the way evening settles over a field after a long day of work. They come when doors close, when lamps are dimmed, when people drift off to sleep. It is the quiet that follows a completed day, the natural pause between one set of footsteps and the next. But there is another kind of silence. A silence that appears suddenly, without explanation. A silence that feels less like rest and more like absence. When you encounter it, you feel immediately that something is wrong, though you may not yet understand what that something is. The people who first walked onto the grounds of Harrow Hall on the morning of October 15, 1837, would later describe exactly that kind of silence. Not peaceful, not restful. Wrong. Harrow Hall stood in the Carolina backcountry, several miles east of a small trading settlement known at the time as Barracks Crossing. It was not a grand plantation in the way of the great coastal estates that travelers wrote about in letters and journals. There were no towering white columns, no long avenue of ancient oaks stretching dramatically toward the front door. But it was a working plantation, and like every plantation of its kind, it had a rhythm. Fields stretched out behind the main house in long brown rows where cotton had been harvested only weeks earlier. The barn stood to one side of the yard, weathered but sturdy. A small cluster of cabins stood some distance behind the house, arranged in two uneven rows that had grown gradually over the years as the plantation itself expanded. Every morning, the place came alive before sunrise. The first sounds usually came from the kitchen house, where a fire would be started before the light reached the tree line. Smoke drifting slowly upward, the faint clatter of pots, voices moving quietly through the morning air. After that came the sounds of movement from the cabins, doors opening, footsteps on packed dirt, someone calling to a child, someone laughing. someone coughing in the cold autumn air. It was a pattern that had repeated itself almost every day for more than 20 years. That is why the silence on the morning of October 15th was so disturbing, because it broke that pattern completely. The first outsider to notice it was a farmer named Hiram Cook. Cook lived about 3 miles from Harrow Hall on a modest piece of land he worked with the help of his 2 sons and an occasional hired hand. He was known in the area as a steady, practical man, not the kind who indulged strange ideas or told dramatic stories. When Cook described what he experienced that morning, he was careful to say this very clearly. He was not a man given to imagination. But something about Harrow Hall that morning unsettled him from the moment he turned his wagon onto the dirt lane that led to the property. He had been expected that day. A week earlier, he had arranged with Elias Tanner, the owner of Harrow Hall, to deliver a wagon load of split-rail fence posts. Autumn was the usual season for repairing boundary fences, and Cook had spent several days cutting and splitting the timber himself. He left his farm shortly after sunrise. The air that morning carried the particular sharpness that comes with mid-October in the Carolina backcountry. Cool enough that a man's breath sometimes showed faintly in the early light, but not yet cold enough to bite through heavy clothing. Cook's wagon rolled slowly along the rutted road, the wheels creaking softly under the weight of the timber stacked behind him. Riding alongside on horseback was a hired man named James, a younger fellow Cook had brought along to help unload the posts once they arrived. It was an ordinary trip. Cook had driven that same route dozens of times before. Nothing about the journey itself gave him any reason to expect that this morning would be different from any other. But as the wagon approached the entrance to Harrow Hall's property, something began to feel wrong. At first, it was subtle. The lane that led toward the house passed between 2 stretches of open field, and as Cook guided the wagon through the familiar turn, he found himself listening for sounds he expected to hear. There were none. No voices, no distant calling, no animals shifting in the yard. He frowned slightly, though he said nothing to the man riding beside him. It was still early. Perhaps the people at the plantation had simply started their work in the fields before sunrise. Harvest season often demanded that kind of schedule. Cook drove the wagon farther up the lane. The house came into view between the trees. Still no sound. By the time the wagon reached the open yard in front of the house, Cook had begun to feel something he would later describe in words that puzzled even him. It was not fear, exactly. It was the feeling that a place which should have been full of life had somehow been emptied. He pulled the wagon to a stop. For a moment, neither man spoke. They both listened. The wind moved lightly through the cotton stalks in the fields beyond the yard. Dry stems brushed together with a faint rattling sound. Otherwise, nothing. Cook climbed down from the wagon slowly. Strange, he muttered, almost to himself. James slid off his horse and looped the reins loosely around a fence rail. The front door of the main house was closed. Smoke was not rising from the kitchen house chimney. Cook took a few steps across the yard and called out toward the house. "Mr. Tanner?" His voice carried clearly through the still air. No answer. He tried again, louder this time. Still nothing. By now, the quiet had begun to settle over both men in a way that was difficult to ignore. Cook walked up the short set of steps leading to the front door and knocked firmly. The sound echoed inside the house. For several seconds, they waited. Then Cook reached for the handle. The door opened easily. Inside, the air held the faint smell of cold food and extinguished candles. Cook stepped cautiously into the entryway. What he saw in the dining room beyond stopped him in place. The table was set, Plates had been arranged carefully around the surface. Cutlery rested beside them exactly where someone had placed it. Glasses stood upright. In the center of the table sat a covered dish. At first glance, it looked as though supper had been prepared for the household. But the chairs around the table were empty. Cook stepped closer. He lifted the lid of the dish. Inside was food that had clearly been cooked the night before, but never eaten. Cold now. Untouched. Behind him, James shifted uneasily. "Maybe they stepped out," he said. Cook did not answer. Something about the room felt wrong in a way that was difficult to describe. Candles in the nearby parlor had burned down completely, leaving hardened pools of wax on the metal holders. A piano stood near the window. Its lid was partially open, and a sheet of music rested on the stand as if someone had been playing only hours before. Cook walked slowly through the house, calling out again. No reply. Upstairs, the bedrooms showed the quiet disorder of ordinary life. A bed, partially made, a coat draped over the back of a chair, nothing broken, nothing disturbed, and no one there. When Cook stepped back outside into the yard, the silence seemed even heavier than before. He looked toward the cabins behind the main house. "Let's check there," he said. They walked together along the narrow path leading toward the small row of wooden cabins that housed the plantation's enslaved community. As they approached, Cook noticed the first detail that truly unsettled him. The doors were open. Not all of them, but several. A few hung slightly ajar, moving gently in the breeze. Cook stepped into the first cabin. Inside, everything appeared normal. A small bed, a wooden chair, a few cooking pots hanging on hooks, but no people. The second cabin was the same, and the third. By the time they had walked the full length of the row, the reality had begun to settle in around them. The cabins were empty. Completely empty. Not in the chaotic way a place looks after a disaster or sudden attack. Nothing had been overturned, nothing broken. The belongings that could not easily be carried were still there, but the people who had lived in those cabins were gone. Cook walked the row a second time, moving slowly now, as though he expected someone to step out from behind one of the doorways and explain the strange scene. No one did. Behind the cabins, the tree line stood dark and still. Beyond it stretched miles of Carolina countryside. Cook finally stopped near the end of the row. For several seconds, he said nothing. Then he turned toward James. His voice, when he spoke, carried a quiet certainty that neither man would ever forget. "They're gone." James stared at him. "All of them?" Cook nodded slowly. He looked once more across the silent yard toward the empty house, toward the cabins where life had clearly existed only hours earlier. Then he added, almost under his breath, "God Almighty." Later that day, when the county sheriff arrived to investigate, Cook would describe the scene as carefully as he could. He explained that nothing looked disturbed. There had been no signs of violence, no broken doors, no scattered belongings. Just a plantation where 43 people who had lived and worked there the day before had disappeared during the night. Not one body had been found. Not one witness had seen them leave. And the strangest part of all was this. The place still looked as if those people had only stepped away for a moment. Candles burned down in the house, a supper table left waiting, cabin doors standing open to a morning that arrived without them. The sheriff listened to Cook's account carefully. Then he began asking the question that would haunt the story of Harrow Hall for the next 100 years. How did 43 people vanish from a plantation in a single night without leaving a trace? To understand what happened at Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th, 1837, you first have to understand what Harrow Hall was. Not simply as a plantation, not simply as a place on a map, but as a small, self-contained world. A world with its own rules, its own rhythms, and its own quiet hierarchies, many of which were never written down, but were understood by everyone who lived there. Harrow Hall sat in the Carolina backcountry, in a stretch of land that in the 1830s felt distant from nearly everything. The nearest trading settlement was a place known as Barracks Crossing, roughly 18 miles away by wagon road. It was little more than a cluster of buildings gathered near a creek, a general store, a blacksmith shop, a church that doubled as a meeting hall, and a few scattered homes. Beyond that lay miles of countryside, fields, woodland, creeks cutting through low ground that flooded in the spring. If you stood at the edge of Harrow Hall's property and looked outward across the surrounding land, what you saw was space. Open, quiet, and largely unchanged from one season to the next. The plantation itself covered roughly 500 acres. Most of it had been cleared decades earlier and turned into cotton fields. By the autumn of 1837, those fields had already been harvested for the season. What remained were the brittle stalks of cotton plants stretching across the landscape in long rows, dry and brown beneath the October sky. When the wind passed through them, they made a sound that some visitors later described as strangely human. A faint, rattling whisper, like something trying to speak and failing. The main house of Harrow Hall stood near the center of the property on slightly higher ground. It was a two-story timber structure built in the early 1810s. It was not a grand house. Travelers who had seen the elaborate plantations along the coastal rivers might have found Harrow Hall almost modest. There were no towering white columns, no sweeping oak avenue, no elaborate gardens designed to impress visitors. Instead, the house had the solid, practical appearance of something built by a man who cared more about durability than elegance. That man was Cornelius Tanner. Cornelius Tanner had come south from Virginia sometime around 1810, carrying with him two things that defined much of his life: ambition and money. The money allowed him to purchase land in the Carolina backcountry when land there was still relatively inexpensive. The ambition drove him to transform that land into something permanent. Over the course of several years, he oversaw the clearing of fields, the construction of the main house, and the gradual expansion of the plantation's working structures. A kitchen house stood a short distance behind the main residence, separated for practical reasons related to heat and fire. Beyond it stood a smokehouse where meat was preserved, a barn large enough to hold several animals and store feed, a cotton gin house where harvested cotton could be processed before shipment to market. And finally, set farther back near the edge of the cleared land, stood the cabins. Cornelius Tanner did not live to see the plantation reach its most productive years. He died in 1831. The property passed to his only surviving son, a man named Elias Tanner. Elias Tanner was 34 years old in the autumn of 1837. Those who knew him described him as serious, careful, and somewhat reserved. He was not a man prone to loud outbursts or theatrical displays of authority. If anything, his temperament leaned toward quiet calculation. He had grown up watching his father build Harrow Hall from a patch of rough land into a functioning plantation. From a young age, he understood that the success of such a place depended on constant attention. Fields had to be managed, accounts had to be balanced, workers had to be supervised, supplies had to move in and out with predictable regularity. If any part of that system faltered, the entire operation could begin to unravel. Elias Tanner believed deeply in maintaining order. But there was another reason he worked so hard to preserve the appearance of stability at Harrow Hall: debt. Cotton plantations in the early 19th century often operated on complicated systems of credit. Landowners borrowed money against future harvests, against equipment, and sometimes against the value of the enslaved labor force itself. Elias Tanner had inherited not only the land his father left behind, but also the financial obligations tied to it. Managing those obligations required constant effort. He could not afford serious disruption. Living with Elias in the main house was his wife, Elenina Tanner. Elenina had come to Harrow Hall several years earlier as a bride. She was 22 when she arrived, the daughter of a merchant family from Columbia. Her upbringing had been comfortable, even refined by the standards of the Carolina backcountry. She brought with her several crates of household goods, a piano, and a set of habits shaped by a life that had taken place largely indoors. People who encountered her often described her as composed, thoughtful, well-read. Unlike many women in similar positions, she had received a fairly broad education for the time. She read books. She wrote letters, frequently to family members in Columbia, and she spent long evenings practicing the piano in the parlor of the Harrow Hall house. But beneath that calm exterior, there were hints, subtle ones, that Elenina Tanner lived with a private awareness of the contradictions surrounding her. Her life at Harrow Hall depended entirely on a system she rarely spoke about directly. Some historians who later examined her surviving letters believed she struggled with that knowledge more than she allowed anyone around her to see. Also living in the house was Elias's younger brother, Garrett Tanner. Garrett was 28 years old in 1837 and had arrived at Harrow Hall only the year before. His presence there had raised a few quiet questions among neighbors. For several years, Garrett had lived in Charleston, where he had apparently been involved in various business ventures. None of them had ended particularly well. By the spring of 1836, he had accumulated enough debts that remaining in Charleston became difficult. Returning to Harrow Hall offered a temporary refuge. Garrett and Elias maintained a polite relationship, but few people believed they were especially close. They ate at the same table, they shared the same house, but there was a distance between them. The kind of distance that sometimes forms between brothers whose lives have followed very different paths. The final figure in the hierarchy of Harrow Hall's white household was the overseer, a man named Ward Driscoll. If any single individual on the plantation held the responsibility for maintaining its daily order, it was the overseer. Driscoll arrived at Harrow Hall in March of 1837. He had been hired after the sudden departure of the previous overseer, Clifton Haywood. Haywood had managed the plantation's workforce for 3 years before leaving in a manner that neighbors later described as abrupt. He packed his belongings late one evening, saddled his horse before dawn, and rode away without giving much explanation. Such departures were not entirely uncommon in that profession. Overseers often moved from property to property. Still, the quiet way Haywood left behind a small trail of speculation. Ward Driscoll replaced him. He was a tall, lean man with a weathered face that suggested years spent outdoors. Those who met him often remarked on his eyes. They were sharp, watchful. He had the habit of studying people carefully before speaking, as though he were always measuring the distance between what someone said and what they actually meant. Driscoll arrived with a single letter of recommendation from a plantation owner near the North Carolina border named Gideon Falk. The letter described him as a man of decisive character and firm discipline. What it did not describe was the precise reason Driscoll had left Falk's employment. That detail would only emerge years later through scattered records that suggested his departure from that property had been almost as sudden as Haywood's departure from Harrow Hall. By the summer of 1837, Harrow Hall had settled into a familiar rhythm under Driscoll's supervision. Each day followed a pattern. Work began early. Fields were inspected, tools distributed, tasks assigned. In the evening, the workers returned to the cabins, the main house quieted, and the plantation settled again into the slow, breathing rhythm of rural life. To an outsider, Harrow Hall looked orderly, stable, predictable. But appearances in places like Harrow Hall could be misleading, because the true knowledge of how the plantation functioned did not reside primarily in the main house. It existed in the cabins, among the people who lived there. Those people understood the land more deeply than anyone else. They knew which sections of the fields flooded first after heavy rain. They knew where the soil stayed firm even in wet seasons. They knew the sounds of every animal in the barn. They knew the routines of the people who supervised them. And they understood something else as well. They understood the hidden weaknesses of the system that controlled them. One of the most respected men among the people in the cabins was a man named Reuben. Reuben was 41 years old in the autumn of 1837. He had been brought to Harrow Hall as a child. At the age of 7, he arrived with Cornelius Tanner from Virginia and had spent the next 34 years living on that land. Over time, he had become something rare on a plantation. Indispensable. Reuben knew almost everything about Harrow Hall. He knew how to repair equipment in the barn. He knew how to handle animals. He knew which boards in the cotton gin creaked in a way that meant they needed replacing. He moved through the property with the quiet confidence of someone who understood every corner of it. But the most striking thing about Reuben was not his skill. It was his steadiness. He spoke carefully. He observed everything. And when he did speak, people listened. His wife, Dia, worked in the kitchen house and often inside the main house itself. Dia possessed a different kind of intelligence. Where Reuben understood land and tools and systems, Dia understood people. She noticed small things others overlooked. A change in someone's tone, a glance exchanged across a room, the moment a conversation shifted from casual talk into something more serious. Working inside the main house gave her access to spaces most people in the cabins rarely entered. She moved quietly through those spaces, observing far more than anyone realized. And then there was August. August was 19 years old. He had been born at Harrow Hall. His father had died several years earlier. His mother had been sold to another plantation in Georgia when August was 15. Since then, something in the young man had hardened. Not outwardly. He worked steadily. He followed instructions. But those who knew him well sensed a depth of thought behind his quiet behavior. August possessed one ability that set him apart. He could read. Not fluently, not in the polished way of someone educated in a school, but enough to understand written words when he encountered them. He had learned in fragments, a discarded newspaper page here, a shipping label there. Over time, he had pieced together enough knowledge to recognize letters, words, and simple sentences. That ability would soon become more important than anyone at Harrow Hall could have imagined. Because in July of 1837, a letter arrived. It came with the ordinary postal delivery from Barracks Crossing. Several pieces of correspondence were delivered that morning: a newspaper, a business invoice, and a single sealed letter addressed to Elias Tanner. At first, it appeared to be just another document in the constant flow of paperwork that accompanied plantation life. But when Elias Tanner opened it at the dining table and began to read, something changed in his expression. Dia noticed it immediately. She had seen Elias read hundreds of letters, but she had never seen his face look quite like that. It was not anger. It was calculation. The expression of a man suddenly realizing that the situation he thought he controlled might not be under his control at all. He folded the letter carefully, placed it inside his coat, and left the room without finishing his coffee. Dia said nothing, but she understood something important in that moment. Something had arrived at Harrow Hall that morning. something serious enough to disturb a man who rarely allowed himself to show disturbance. 3 days later, she found the letter in the drawer of the study desk. She did not take it. Instead, she memorized what she could, and what she learned would soon place the entire community of Harrow Hall in immediate danger. The letter concerned debt, a large one. Money Elias Tanner owed to a creditor in Colombia. The debt had been secured against the plantation's enslaved workforce, and if it could not be repaid before the end of the year, the creditor would enforce the agreement, which meant something very simple. Up to 30 people at Harrow Hall could be sold, families separated, lives scattered across plantations hundreds of miles apart. For the people living in the cabins, the arrival of that letter changed everything. Because once that letter existed, the future they had known for decades could vanish in a single transaction. And somewhere in the quiet spaces of Harrow Hall that summer, the first thoughts of a plan began to take shape. The letter arrived at Harrow Hall on a warm morning in July of 1837. At first, nothing about it seemed unusual. Mail arrived at the plantation several times each week from Barracks Crossing. Most of it contained ordinary business matters, shipping notices, supply invoices, the occasional letter from relatives in Columbia or Charleston. Elias Tanner opened that morning's correspondence at the dining table as he often did. Dia was nearby, clearing the remains of breakfast. She moved quietly around the room, stacking plates and gathering utensils. Her presence was so familiar in that space that Elias barely noticed her most mornings. But Dia noticed him. She noticed everything. When Elias unfolded the single sheet of paper inside the sealed letter, something in his face changed. The shift was small, a tightening around the eyes, a pause in the way he breathed. He read the page once, then again. Dia did not attempt to read over his shoulder. She understood better than that. Instead, she watched his expression. Elias Tanner was not a man who revealed emotion easily. Even when angered, he tended to respond with cold calculation rather than open displays. But that morning, there was something else in his face. Concern. And beneath it, something more dangerous. Fear. He folded the letter slowly and slipped it into the inside pocket of his coat. Then he stood up without finishing his coffee. "I have business to attend to," he said quietly. The words were addressed to no one in particular. Moments later, he left the room. Dia finished clearing the table. She carried the dishes into the kitchen house and set them down with deliberate care. Then she stood still for a moment, thinking. She did not know what the letter said, but she knew it mattered. 3 days passed before she saw it again. The opportunity came on a quiet afternoon when Elias Tanner had ridden to Barracks Crossing. Dia entered the study as part of her regular cleaning routine. The desk drawer where Elias kept his correspondence was slightly open. Inside lay a small stack of folded papers. Among them was the letter. Dia hesitated only briefly. She did not remove it. Instead, she unfolded the page carefully and read what she could before closing the drawer again. She was not accustomed to reading long passages of writing, but certain phrases stood out clearly enough to understand their meaning. The letter was from a land agent in Colombia, and it concerned debt. A large debt. Elias Tanner had borrowed money several years earlier, using the plantation and its workforce as collateral. The debt had not been repaired. Now the creditor was demanding payment. If the balance was not satisfied before the end of the year, the agreement would be enforced. In plain terms, that meant the sale of enslaved individuals from Harrow Hall to cover the amount owed. Dia stood in the quiet study holding that knowledge in her mind. The letter estimated that as many as 30 people might have to be sold. 30. There were only 43 people living in the cabins behind the main house. 30 was not a partial loss. 30 meant the destruction of the entire community. Families separated. Children sold away. People sent hundreds of miles to plantations they had never seen. Dia folded the letter exactly as she had found it and returned it to the drawer. Then she left the study and walked quickly across the yard. She did not speak to anyone about it that day. Not until she found August. August was working near the barn that afternoon, repairing a broken harness. Dia approached him slowly. She glanced around to be certain no one else was close enough to hear. Then she told him what she had seen. August listened without interrupting. When she finished speaking, he remained silent for a long moment. Then he asked a single question. "Where's the letter now?" "In the study drawer." August nodded. 2 nights later, he found his chance. Elias had gone into town again. The house was quiet. August entered the study with the cautious movements of someone who understood exactly what risk he was taking. He opened the drawer. The letter was still there. Reading it took time. The handwriting was tight and formal, but the meaning eventually became clear. By the time August folded the page and returned it to the drawer, the future of Harrow Hall looked very different than it had only a week earlier. That evening, he went to find Reuben. Reuben was sitting on the step outside his cabin watching the last light fade from the fields. August approached slowly. He explained what Dia had seen. He described the contents of the letter. He spoke quietly, carefully, repeating certain details to make sure nothing was misunderstood. When he finished, Reuben did not respond immediately. He sat motionless for several minutes. Then he asked one question. "How long?" August answered. "Until the end of the year." Reuben looked out across the darkening land. The cotton fields stretched into the distance, silent beneath the evening sky. Finally, he spoke again. "Then we have until October." August frowned slightly. "Why October?" Reuben's voice remained calm. "Because after October, the roads are watched more closely." He paused. "And because that is when the nights are darkest." What August did not yet understand was that the possibility of leaving Harrow Hall had existed in Reuben's mind long before that letter arrived. 4 years earlier, in the summer of 1833, a man named Tobias had come to the plantation to repair the roof of the barn. Tobias was a free black carpenter from a town called Lancaster, several dozen miles to the north. He worked quietly for 3 days, repairing broken beams and replacing weathered boards. On the evening of his second day, he and Reuben sat together in the barn after the others had gone. Their conversation lasted hours. Tobias spoke carefully. He described routes through the countryside that avoided heavily traveled roads. He mentioned creek crossings that could hide tracks. He described farms where sympathetic families might provide shelter for travelers moving north. He explained why autumn nights were best for long journeys, why new moon evenings offered the darkest cover, why Sunday departures allowed the longest delay before anyone noticed. Reuben listened to every word. He asked questions, specific questions. When Tobias left Harrow Hall the following morning, the roof was repaired. But he had also left behind something else: knowledge. For 4 years, Reuben carried that knowledge quietly. He said nothing about it openly. Instead, he observed. He learned who could be trusted, who had the strength to attempt a journey, who had children young enough to carry and old enough to walk. By the time August told him about the letter in the summer of 1837, much of the thinking had already been done. Now the situation had changed. The plan could no longer remain a distant possibility. It had become necessary. Throughout August and September, conversations began to take place across the cabins at Harrow Hall. Not meetings, nothing so obvious, just quiet discussions between individuals who trusted one another. The circle of knowledge grew slowly, carefully. By the time autumn approached, most of the adults in the cabin community understood that something extraordinary was being considered. Then in September came an opportunity. A Methodist camp meeting scheduled at a place called Peavy Grove. Such gatherings were common in the Carolina backcountry. Hundreds of people traveled from surrounding farms and plantations to attend several days of preaching, singing, and communal meals. Plantation owners often allowed enslaved workers to attend. Elias Tanner was no exception. 28 people from Harrow Hall made the journey to Peavy Grove. Outwardly, they appeared to be doing what everyone else there was doing, listening to sermons, sharing food, talking with friends from neighboring properties. But beneath the surface, other conversations were taking place. Reuben spoke with a man named Cyrus, who had once traveled part of the northern route Tobias had described. Cyrus confirmed several of the landmarks: a creek crossing, a narrow ridge line, a farmhouse where travelers had once found shelter. Dia spoke with a woman named Harriet. Harriet had attempted escape twice in previous years. Both attempts had failed. But Harriet had learned important lessons during those journeys: which roads to avoid, where patrols were most active, where the terrain offered natural concealment. Meanwhile, August moved quietly through the gathering until he found someone he had been told to look for: a white man named Edmund. Edmund had connections to the Quaker network operating quietly throughout parts of the region. Their conversation lasted only 11 minutes, but in that time, August received 3 critical pieces of information: a phrase that would identify him to the first safe house, the location of the first major landmark north of Harrow Hall, and confirmation that travelers arriving from the south in October would be expected. When the Harrow Hall group returned home from the camp meeting, nothing outward had changed. Work continued. Fields were tended. The daily routines of plantation life carried on exactly as before. But the plan had taken its final shape. The departure would happen in October, on a night when the moon offered little light. They would travel in groups. They would move north. And if everything went as planned, they would disappear before anyone realized they were gone. There was only one problem. Ward Driscoll had begun to notice something different. He could not say exactly what, but the evenings around the cabins had changed. The quiet felt deliberate. Conversations ended abruptly when he approached. People seemed more watchful, more aware. Driscoll began adjusting his rounds. Sometimes he walked the cabin row earlier than usual, sometimes later, sometimes in the middle of the night. He said nothing to Elias Tanner, not yet, but he was watching, very carefully. And the night of October 14th was drawing closer. By the first week of October in 1837, the plan that had taken years to imagine and months to prepare had entered its final stage. Nothing about Harrow Hall looked unusual. From the outside, the plantation continued to function exactly as it always had. The cotton had already been harvested, the fields stretching out behind the house in long brown rows of brittle stalks. Wagons had come and gone carrying bales toward market roads. Tools were stored in the barn. The smokehouse door creaked open and closed just as it had every autumn for years. To anyone watching casually, life at Harrow Hall appeared calm, routine, predictable. But beneath that surface, every day now carried a quiet urgency. The people in the cabins knew that time had begun to move faster. The letter in Elias Tanner's desk had changed everything. The threat it carried, the possibility that 30 people could be sold away before winter, had turned what was once only an idea into a deadline. October was their window, and the window was closing. During those final 7 days before the chosen night, preparations moved forward carefully, almost invisibly. Supplies were gathered, but never in large quantities. A handful of dried corn here, a strip of salt pork saved from a communal meal there, a length of rope quietly set aside from the barn, a scrap of cloth that might later serve as a bandage. None of these things alone would have appeared suspicious. Every item could easily be explained as part of the ordinary flow of plantation life. But over time, small caches began to appear. One beneath a loose board in the smokehouse floor, another inside a hollow tree at the far edge of the property, a third buried under leaves near the creek that marked the northern boundary of the land. Reuben oversaw these arrangements quietly. He did not give orders, he simply suggested things. A person might find him standing beside a fence rail at dusk, speaking softly about the weather or the condition of the fields. Somewhere in that conversation he might mention a certain tree or a certain bend in the creek. The person listening understood. Supplies would appear there within a day or two. Just as important as gathering food was the question of who would travel. That question weighed heavily on everyone. There were 43 people living in the cabins behind the main house, but not all of them could make the journey north. Some were too old, others too young. A few carried illnesses that would make a long walk through rough country almost impossible. Reuben knew that forcing everyone to go could endanger the entire group. Those who stayed behind would face questioning after the disappearance was discovered. If they knew too much, they might suffer for it. So difficult conversations began to take place. One of the hardest was with a man called Old Silas. Silas had lived at Harrow Hall longer than anyone else except Reuben. His hair had turned completely white, and his hands shook slightly when he tried to grip heavy tools. Reuben spoke with him one evening beside the barn. The conversation was quiet, short. Silas listened carefully to what was being proposed. Then he nodded slowly. "My walking days are behind me," he said. There was no anger in his voice, no bitterness, only acceptance. Another conversation took place with a woman named Bess, who had turned 63 that summer. Bess suffered from a heart condition that sometimes left her gasping for breath during the night. She listened to Reuben's explanation and closed her eyes for a moment. Then she said something that would stay with him for years. "Some of us were meant to open the door," she said softly, "and some were meant to watch others walk through it." Not everyone who remained behind did so easily. There were tears, arguments, moments when people struggled with the knowledge that the opportunity before them could not include everyone they loved. But the decisions were made with care. By the evening of October 13th, the people of Harrow Hall had quietly divided themselves into two groups, those who would go and those who would stay. The following day, the day of October 14th, passed with eerie normality. The sky was clear, the temperature mild. Ward Driscoll conducted his usual rounds through the fields during the afternoon. He noticed nothing unusual. Work ended at the usual hour. People returned to the cabins. From the main house, Elias Tanner could see small figures moving across the yard as evening settled. Everything looked exactly as it always had. Inside the kitchen house, Dia prepared the evening meal. She moved through the familiar motions of cooking with practiced calm. Bread placed on the table, stew ladled into bowls, utensils arranged carefully. If anyone had watched her closely, they might have noticed something different in her face. Not fear, not panic, but focus. The kind of concentration that appears when a person understands they are standing at the edge of something that cannot be undone. When the meal was ready, Dia carried the dishes into the main house. She set the dining table for 9. Plates, glasses, cutlery, everything arranged with the same careful attention she had given that task hundreds of times before. The candles were lit. The room glowed softly in the early evening darkness. But Dia did not remain there long. She returned to the kitchen house briefly. Then she stepped outside into the yard. The distance between the kitchen house and the first line of trees behind the cabins was perhaps 40 feet. She crossed it without hesitation. Once she reached the trees, she did not look back. The first group had already begun to move. Families with children left first. They traveled quietly through the trees behind the cabins and followed the narrow path that led toward the creek along the eastern boundary of the property. Some parents carried infants wrapped tightly in cloth. Older children were guided by the hand. Everyone moved slowly, carefully. Branches brushed softly against clothing as they passed. No one spoke louder than a whisper. The second group waited nearly 30 minutes before departing. These were mostly strong field workers, men and women capable of moving quickly once the journey began. They headed northwest toward the neighboring Sims property. Reuben had chosen this route because the northern boundary of that land remained unfenced for nearly 2 miles. Crossing there would leave little evidence behind. No broken gate, no disturbed fence line, just footprints that the wind or morning dew might soon erase. Their path would eventually lead them toward the same creek crossing the first group intended to reach. The third and final group remained behind the longest. Reuben stood among them near the edge of the tree line. August was beside him. So were 2 other men and a woman named Phoebe. Phoebe had injured her ankle months earlier and still walked with a slight limp, but she insisted on remaining with the last group. She knew parts of the northern route better than anyone else there. If something happened to Reuben or August during the journey, she could guide the others. They waited until the plantation had grown completely quiet. From where they stood, they could see the glow of candlelight through the windows of the main house. They could hear the faint creaking of the barn door in the wind. Otherwise, nothing. At last, Reuben nodded. It was time. One by one, the final group stepped into the trees. Reuben lingered a moment longer. He turned and looked back across the property. For 34 years, he had lived on that land. He knew every corner of it. The barn where he had repaired broken tools, the fields where he had worked through countless summers, the cabins where children had been born and elders had died. All of it lay behind him now. He did not allow himself long to look. There was too much distance to cover before dawn. Without another word, he stepped into the darkness beneath the trees. By midnight, the cabins of Harrow Hall stood completely empty. The barn animals shifted quietly in their stalls. A light wind moved across the harvested cotton fields. Inside the main house, the candles on the dining table continued to burn. Their flames flickered gently in the still air, waiting for people who would never return. And across the back country of South Carolina, 43 people moved silently through the night toward a future no one at Harrow Hall yet knew had already begun. By late morning on October 15, 1837, the quiet mystery of Harrow Hall had begun to attract attention beyond the empty yard and silent cabins. Word traveled quickly in the Carolina backcountry. By the time the county sheriff arrived, several nearby farmers had already heard that something unusual had happened at the Tanner plantation. Wagons appeared along the lane. Men gathered near the yard speaking in low voices. Some walked toward the cabins, peering into the open doors as if expecting to find an explanation hidden somewhere inside. None did. The man responsible for sorting through what had happened was Sheriff Porter Baines. Porter Baines was 51 years old in the autumn of 1837. He had served as sheriff of the county for more than a decade and was widely regarded as a steady, unsentimental man. But nothing in his career quite resembled what he found waiting at Harrow Hall. He arrived shortly before noon, accompanied by 2 deputies. The first thing Baines noticed was the same thing Hiram Cook had described earlier that morning: the silence. Not the quiet of a normal farm where people were working in distant fields, but the deeper stillness of a place where activity had stopped entirely. He began his investigation methodically. First the house, then the yard, then the cabins. He noted the supper table still arranged inside the dining room. Plates, glasses, and utensils had been set carefully, but the meal itself had never been eaten. The food had gone cold overnight. The candles had burned down to hardened pools of wax. There were no overturned chairs, no broken windows, no signs of struggle. The cabins told a similar story. Beds were unmade or partially arranged in ordinary ways. Cooking tools remained hanging from hooks. Clothing too worn to travel with had been left behind. It did not look like panic. It looked like departure. Baines interviewed the witnesses who had first arrived that morning. Hiram Cook repeated the account he had given earlier, explaining exactly what he and the hired man had seen when they reached the plantation. The details were consistent. Everything had appeared normal, except for the complete absence of people. That absence included someone Baines had expected to find immediately: Ward Driscoll. The overseer's room was located in a small structure attached to the barn. When Baines entered it, he found Driscoll's belongings still in place. A coat hung from a wooden peg. A ledger lay open on a small table. His horse stood calmly in a stall inside the barn. But Ward Driscoll himself was nowhere to be found. Baines made note of the detail but did not yet draw any conclusions. Next, he spoke with Elias Tanner. The plantation owner arrived at Harrow Hall not long after the sheriff had begun examining the property. Tanner had spent the previous night at a neighboring farm owned by a man named Abner Pruitt, approximately 1.5 miles south of the plantation. According to Tanner, the visit had been arranged to discuss a boundary fence dispute between the 2 properties. The conversation had continued late into the evening, and Tanner had decided to remain overnight rather than travel back in the dark. Pruitt confirmed this account when Baines questioned him later. The explanation was plausible, but the timing was difficult to ignore. On the very night that 43 people left Harrow Hall, the plantation owner had been absent from the property. Baines recorded the statement without comment. Then he spoke with the only person who had spent the night in the main house: Elelonina Tanner. Elelonina received the sheriff in the parlor with remarkable composure. Her voice remained steady as she described the events of the previous evening. She had gone to bed at her usual hour. She had heard nothing unusual during the night. When she woke in the morning, the house had appeared exactly as the sheriff now saw it: quiet, empty, the supper table untouched. Baines asked whether she had heard movement from the cabins at any point during the evening. She answered simply, "No." Whether that answer was entirely true would become one of the lingering questions surrounding Harrow Hall. Because Elelonina Tanner had lived at the plantation long enough to recognize the ordinary sounds of the cabins at night: laughter, conversation, the movement of people returning from the fields. These were familiar elements of daily life. Their sudden absence would have been noticeable. Yet Elelonina insisted she had heard nothing. After 4 hours examining the property, Sheriff Baines prepared his initial report. 43 enslaved individuals were missing. No evidence of violence had been discovered. The most reasonable explanation appeared to be a coordinated escape during the night of October 14th. Baines notified neighboring counties and requested assistance locating the missing group. Descriptions were circulated along the main roads and through nearby towns, but the response that followed was remarkable for its emptiness. No travelers reported seeing a large group moving through the countryside. No farmers claimed to have encountered them along the roads. No patrols intercepted them. It was as though the group had vanished into the landscape itself. Weeks passed, then months. Gradually, the official investigation began to fade. 6 weeks after the disappearance, Sheriff Baines filed a document placing the inquiry in abeyance, effectively closing it, unless new evidence appeared. Even by the standards of the time, the speed of that decision raised quiet questions. The disappearance of a handful of enslaved individuals often prompted months of search efforts, but the disappearance of 43 people had produced little more than a brief investigation and a closed file. The final report included a single unusual sentence: "The circumstances being of a kind that do not benefit from extended public inquiry." The meaning of that phrase was never clarified. The file itself contained gaps where additional documents should have existed: follow-up reports from neighboring counties, interrogation records, and other materials normally preserved during such investigations. Those documents were missing. Lost, perhaps, or removed. The mystery surrounding Harrow Hall might have remained buried indefinitely if not for a journalist named Oliver Hatch. Hatch worked for a newspaper in Columbia during the 1870s. Nearly 40 years after the events at Harrow Hall, he encountered a partial copy of Sheriff Baines's report in a county archive. The story immediately intrigued him. 43 people had disappeared in a single night. And yet the historical record contained almost nothing about what had happened afterward. Hatch began asking questions. His research took years. He traveled through several states, searching archives, church records, and private collections of letters. Slowly, he began uncovering fragments of information that had never been connected before. One of his most important discoveries came from a woman named Adeline Spratt. Adeline was 73 years old when Hatch found her in 1875. Her grandmother had once worked as a seamstress for Elena Tanner and had maintained correspondence with her for several years after the events of 1837. Adeline possessed 11 of those letters. Most of them contained ordinary news about household matters. But one letter, written in 1842, contained a passage that suggested Elena Tanner had known more than she admitted during the sheriff's investigation. "I do not repent of what I chose not to do," the letter read. Those words suggested that Elena had heard something on the night of October 14th and had chosen to remain silent. Hatch continued his search. Gradually, the outline of the escape began to appear. Records from Quaker communities in Pennsylvania and Ohio confirmed that groups of travelers from the South had passed through the region during the late autumn of 1837. Several documents mentioned a group of 27 individuals arriving together after a long journey north. 27. The number appeared again and again in different records. It matched the number Hatch believed had reached free territory. One account described a woman named Phoebe living in Ohio by the 1870s. She was the head of a large family and spoke occasionally about a journey she had taken many years earlier. Another document from a Quaker meeting in Philadelphia referred to a young man named August who had arrived in the winter of 1838 and was learning to read more fluently with assistance from members of the community. Hatch believed this was the same August who had once lived at Harrow Hall. The most moving discovery came from a short letter dated January 4th, 1838. The handwriting was careful but unpolished. The letter spoke of arriving safely in a place the writer refused to name. It thanked an unnamed recipient for help, and it ended with a simple statement: "What was done with full knowledge and full will." The letter was signed with a single initial, D. Hatch believed it had been written by Dia. By the time Hatch finished assembling his research, the story of Harrow Hall looked very different from the mysterious disappearance described in the sheriff's report. The escape had not been sudden. It had been planned, carefully, patiently, over years. Reuben's knowledge of the northern routes, Dia's observation of the letter, August's ability to read and make contact with allies along the way, all of it had come together on one October night. What appeared to be an impossible disappearance was, in fact, something far more extraordinary. It was a coordinated act of determination carried out by people who refused to accept the future others had written for them. The silence that fell over Harrow Hall on the night of October 14th was not the silence of confusion or fear. It was the silence left behind when 43 people stepped away from a place that had claimed their lives and walked toward a different one. Some were captured, some were forced to return, but 27 reached freedom, and the world they left behind never fully understood how they had done it. The silence of Harrow Hall wasn't emptiness. It was the sound of 43 people choosing their own future.